Hello, everyone. Welcome to Monsoon 2022 Sea Conversations, titled Drawing Out Natures. I'm Rohit Mazumdar from the School of Environment and Architecture. This is the seventh conversation of this series, which foregrounds the role of imaginations in inventing worlds, and also how we come to understand them by constructing realities based on specific ways of seeing, listening, and sensing. It is an engagement towards making visible the invisible relations between natures and the natures of human and modern human agency. We delve into the drawing out of natures to advance imaginaries of engagement with contemporary ecological crises and climate emergencies, and the contests that come to erode and expand socio-spatial claims in the shared ecologies of our worlds. This online series has been co-curated and supported by the Shared Ecologies program of the Shama Foundation, along with the ongoing support of the Urban Center Mumbai. In today's Sea Conversations, we have with us Ignacio Farias, Professor of Urban Anthropology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. His research interests concern current ecological and infrastructural transformations of cities and the associated epistemo-political challenges to the democratization of city making. His most recent work explores the politics of environmental disruptions, from tsunamis over heat to noise. He's also interested in doing urban ethnography as a mode of city making performed with others, such as designers, initiatives, concerned groups, policymakers, and by other means, from moving from textual to material productions. Welcome, Ignacio. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. His presentation today offers a story of collective experimenting and learning based on question, what if we sought to relearn how to practice architecture from animals? By exploring this question and by telling this story, Ignacio Farias aims at circumventing two conventional gestures: helping out animals survive in our contemporary urban environments, or treating animals as food for thought about architectural practice. Following science and technology studies and environmental humanities multispecies concerns, Farias approaches urban animals as epistemic partners for rethinking architectural practice, thus engaging their capacities in attempts at designing with, rather than for or from them. With this introduction, I'd like to hand over the floor to Ignacio. Welcome once again. It's really a pleasure to have you and engage with you in this conversation. I will be here. I'll be switching off my camera and my mic. In case you need anything, you can just call out to me. I'm here. Yeah. You're on mute, Ignacio.
Many thanks, Roy, for this generous presentation. And hi, everyone. From here, I'm now in Berlin. Exactly. So thanks for the invitation as well to all of you, and yeah, for the opportunity to present this work. So let me just check if I will share my screen now. I think it should be working.
It's working.
Perfect. So today I would like to present a paper and also an experience, but a paper that I have written with two colleagues, Tomás Sánchez Criado and Felix Remter, and both of them anthropologists. And I had the opportunity to work with them for about 3 years at the Technical University in Munich. And we were 3 anthropologists and 3 STS scholars that had the opportunity to teach also for 3 years in the Faculty of Architecture. And they were so nice that they even allow us to teach design studio courses. So basically, this paper that I'm going to present today is based on that experience, and there are some other writings that we have done together about this shared experience of teaching in an architectural school from an anthropological, if you want, perspective. So all what I'm going to say today is actually the result of a collective work and collaborative work with these two friends. Just to clarify that before we go on. So I have a paper, and I will basically try to read it in a clear way. And I'm looking forward to the conversations and discussions that we might have afterwards. I think that the presentation shouldn't take longer than 30 to 35 minutes. Okay, so let me begin by saying that the current environmental crisis is without doubt the most important challenge for architecture and urbanism today. Cities and practitioners are responding to this challenge by all sorts of means, right? Searching for more ecological materials, looking how to make green infrastructures more efficient, or developing more sustainable business models. Yet, recent conversations in the field of architecture and urbanism, such as this one, for example, the one around the idea of critical care at the Architektur Centrum in Vienna, suggest a displacement from a conventional focus on mitigation and adaptation measures towards the question of how to care for and how to repair a broken planet. This language of care and repair as an alternative to that of adaptation and mitigation is really productive, I think, and has important consequences for how design and architecture might position themselves today. One element, one important lesson, is that the idea of the global or the planetary might not be the right scale for care and repair practices. Indeed, there is no one planetary crisis, but actually a superposition of situated crises, each unfolding at different scales, different speeds, affecting specific human and non-human bodies in different ways, and therefore requiring also different forms of care and repair. Another consequence of shifting the language towards care is also the need to ask about the role that architecture or design in itself might have played in the production of the current catastrophic present. This is not a matter of self-flagellation or public derision, but it is, I think, a productive question, as it entails asking how to readdress, how to reimagine the practice of architecture. So the starting point for this talk and this work is that what the current crisis needs to put in crisis is the very practice of design. So the key question we argue that designers and architects might need to address is not simply how to design in a more sustainable or in a more ecological or in a more participatory way. This is all fine, but actually how to imagine other ways of doing architecture and urbanism. This goes well beyond Bruno Latour's dictum idea that design is always redesign. That is, that any design activity entails engaging critically with previous orderings and arrangements and try to develop new ones out of the old ones, right? new arrangements that might be better attuned to the present and future. This goes beyond this. The challenge, as we're saying, is not only how to redesign our environments, but maybe how to redesign the discipline itself, the architectural practice itself. So in our exploration, we paid attention to the challenge that the idea of a multi-species justice or a more than human ethics pose to design practices. The more than human, we argue, needs to be more than the content of a design brief. Rather, it demands an opening towards other than human design capacities, for co-design processes. And with that, also an opening towards the uncertainties and unpredictabilities that result from such multi-species interdependencies. Of course, at the same time, we reckon that the task of multi-species care is not devoid of ambivalences and potentially of problems. A multi-species approach to care, or a care approach to multi-species, however you want to put it, cannot fall back in a sort of do-good attitude. But, as some colleagues have said, we need to constantly interrogate the broader dynamics of power that shape which modes of life and being are fostered and rendered legible to dominant regimes of care, and which forms of life are abandoned or disavowed. How to care, then, in architectural practice for terrestrial and multi-species entanglements? So that's the question. In this talk and in our collective work with Tomás and Felix, we have no guidelines to offer or general principles of practice for that. Our offer is a story. It's a story of collective experimentation and learning based on a simple question. What if we sought to relearn how to practice architecture from animals? By exploring this question and also by telling a story, we aim at avoiding two conventional gestures that were already mentioned in the introduction. One gesture is to say, okay, we will help out animals to survive in our contemporary urban environments. Some of the work around the idea of animal-aided design might go in this direction, or we treat animals as food for thought and for reimagining speculatively architectural practice. And some of the work around the idea of animal architecture might go into this direction. Rather, following STS, science and technology studies, also different environmental humanities and multi-species concerns, we try to explore a different avenue, approaching animals as epistemic partners for rethinking architectural practice, and thus engaging their capacities in attempts at designing with rather than for or from them. So in the winter of 2017 and 18, we were teaching in the master's program in architecture of the Technical University of Munich, the third version, the third installment of a series of studio courses that we called Design in Crisis. In all of these courses, our main idea was creating conditions for suspending the practice of architectural design and pushing students to explore other ways of relating architecturally to different issues, such as disasters and humanitarian crises, as well as bodily diversity and accessible infrastructures. The course Designing Crisis 3, Sensing Like an Animal, aimed to imagine a multi-species practice of transforming urban landscapes. We were greatly inspired by Vincent Deprez' question, what could animals say if we ask the right questions, which is the title of a brilliant book that Deprez wrote. And the answers that she provides to this question, what could animals say if we ask the right questions, the answers are stories of animal agency in a wide variety of situations, including experimental settings. And in that way, with the book, she's somehow disputing machinic concepts with which animals are often imagined and treated and modeled in ecological and also in ethological thought. So, the course I want to talk about began with some weeks, 4 weeks, I guess it was, of these sensory explorations aimed at apprehending and also interacting with the urban landscape as an animal or like an animal. The aim thereby was not to simulate animal perception in order to sort of change the experience of the architect, but rather to invent practices and artifacts that could challenge conventional sensory practices, and then also to understand the speculative challenge of sensing like an animal. We took as our guides 3 animals, ants, dogs, and beavers, and we asked our students to kind of document their experiences, something which was many times very difficult to do by all sorts of means, by videos, models, and all sorts of devices. Inspired by the figure of the ant, the sensory challenge was how to relate to space without having a visual overview or perspective, and so we for a whole day blindfolded students had to learn to act and move as an ant colony of sorts, launching expeditions and learning to orient themselves without getting lost, finding things in the landscape, things that they require to build a shelter, moving collectively, and learning to build a safe shelter under, in this case, was a playground. So, all these things, just with the help of their bodies, voices, some umbrellas that we place randomly in their surroundings. And another day, we sought to learn from how dogs practice and know urban space by means of a couple of exercises. Firstly, we walk and were walked by two dogs in a stroll in a garden in Munich. And after that, we started to experiment a little bit with a furniture roller that in German is called Hund, which is the same word for dog, which is Hund. So the roller, the blue one you see there in one of the pictures, has the same name as a dog. So it was a kind of a nice coincidence. And we used that roller to move around space by means of kind of abrupt movements, sniffing and observing the city from a dog's point of view. After a long day of moving around with and like dogs, we asked students to build models or devices that could document and translate how dog see space. So this kind of things. And after 4 weeks of this, we developed the brief that could be at the center of the class. For this, we took as a starting point the third animal that we have been also been experimenting with, the beaver. So we undertook, for example, a day-long site visit to a hotspot area where a bunch of conflicts with beavers happen close to Munich in Bavaria. We met the so-called Biberbeauftragter, which is something like literally, it would mean like beaver representative, which is a person who is in charge of it's like a ranger who's in charge of the beaver populations, and who was also able to recount the story of the beavers that had always lived in the basin of the river Isar, which is the river that goes through Munich, and that beavers had been hunted down, all killed to the last in the 1860s. After that happened, the river was completely channeled in a series of kind of modernist infrastructural interventions. And beavers were only reintroduced to Bavaria and to this area in the 1960s. They were hailed as biodiversity experts capable of intervening in the landscape and creating ecological niches for a large number of species. However, since they've been back in the city in Munich, there had been a bunch of conflicts between beavers and people, and also those, I mean, urban dwellers, but also with those in charge of planning and maintaining the urban green infrastructures of the city. These frictions became much stronger after the municipality engaged in a series of endeavors to renaturalize the Isar River basin that, as I said before, had been channeled totally in the late 19th, early 20th century. And ever since, basically, the frictional encounters of humans and beavers has been always in the local media, for example, displaying a wide variety of highly modernist approaches to this idea of renaturalization. On the one hand, a conservationist attitude towards beaver population management. On the other hand, highly enraged reactions in which beavers or after beavers have taken down ornamental trees or have even caused floods, and all these things described as the destructive behavior of these wild animals. And this leading to authorities to take measures to protect trees and with things like mesh wire and other infrastructures, and to push slowly again beavers out of the city. So, and this latter development that has to do with this competition for the renaturalization of the Isar River, we took for the brief with which we would work, right? So this competition was in 2003 and 2007. So what we said to students is that they should develop a sort of late entry for that public competition that took place in 2003. And the only obstruction, the only challenge that we set and put on their way was that they need to do that. They need to develop this late entry for the competition, like a beaver's contractor. So with this brief, and also accompanied with a set of readings on more than human approaches to design and to the environmental humanities, the idea was to try to push towards questioning anthropocenic assumptions of their design practices. And this seemed to us like a relevant problem because, in a way, if the challenge is to undo the anthropocentric logic that has put us in the middle of the Anthropocene, and if architecture has had its part in this, then the question would be, so what elements of architectural and urban practice should be put on hold or in crisis, and what opportunities, visions, inventions can emerge out of such a crisis? So, so this is how we started, right? The first project ideas that emerge in the context of the class were not really what we were expecting. We didn't know exactly why. So basically, the group decided to make a fairly detailed analysis of beaver presence in the river basin to produce like an inventory, a long list of the different conflicts that had happened in the past. And based on that, they identified 2 sites that they said, okay, this is what we need to develop a proposal for in order to ensure a peaceful coexistence between beavers and humans. We were struggling with this in a way, and we were very critical of this approach, because we thought, okay, well, this is designing for beavers. So we now identify the sites, we develop a proposal for beavers, but this is not really decided, kind of designing with beavers or from the perspective of a beaver or with the beavers. And this kind of intervention is not also, or would not be authorized by the beaver. So posing these questions led to what we were expecting somehow, to a moment of crisis. So then they were saying, okay, so if you don't like our solution, well, tell us how would you respond? Or the briefing is an oxymoron, it is not possible to design like a beaver. Or what's the point of doing a design study course in which we can design? What will I put into my portfolio? These kind of questions. And after long conversations, we started to improvise a solution. And the solution was to say, well, something like, since you have concluded that it is not possible to design like a beaver, perhaps one option to assess is to think about the beavers as your client. But if you opt for this option, what we will ask you is to first design a contract that authorizes you to design on behalf of the beaver. So how to think of a contract by which animals, in this case beaver, would transfer to architects the right to speak on or design on their behalf? So that was the question. And the problem was now just as complex, if not more so, than the initial problem that we had. And it was now a problem we were all in, students and instructors, right? In that context, the French philosopher Michel Serres came to our aid. And so we devoted a session to discuss a premonitory book, which is called The Natural Contract, which is one of the first to address, I think it's from the early 90s, and I guess it's one of the first to address the philosophical and also political implications of the ecological planetary crisis. In this book, Michel Serres poses the question of how to create a contract that would put an end to the relations of violence between a humanity that has become a geological force, so he's saying this in the early 90s, and the planet, that is between humans and non-humans, how we establish a contract that stops the relations of violence between humans and non-humans. And in a crucial passage of the book, Michel Serres explores the origins of contracts and the binding effects that we associate to contracts. And he goes back to ancient Egypt, and he pays attention to the Egyptian figure of the Arpedonapta. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Arpedonapta. And the Arpedonapta is a royal official that after the floodings of the Nile River, he would visit the flooded lands, and with some ropes of cord, will mark the territory again and re-establish the relationships of property. So after the flood, there is someone that comes down and with ropes mark the territory and establish the boundaries of different pieces of land and the relationship of property, right? And that's the origin, according to Michel Serres, of the contract. That's a contract. So he says the social contract, in its origin, was not a written document, but it is a bond, it is a cord, it is a bond that binds. It is a material device, like the cord, that unites and separates, that marks a territory in a more permanent way than words can do. And it is capable of establishing more or less univocal relations between the land and the humans, between the territories and the owners. So we were reading this, right? So it was then clear for us that the contract we needed could well be an object or an artifact that establishes or that allow us to establish a material, a physical, a bodily connection between the parties involved, in these humans and the non-humans, or in our case, the students on the one hand, and the beavers on the other hand, and the river on top of that. So to follow up on this and to kind of incite a conversation about how to create a physical bond, a contract, with a non-human partner, we invited the designer Thomas Twaits to give a public lecture and also to talk with us and with our students in class. So I don't know if you know Thomas Twaits, but in one of his, not anymore so recent, this was, so this is 2016, our class was in 2017, so it was fairly recent now, a while ago, but so in 2016, he had published this speculative project called Goatman, in an attempt where he attempts at taking a holiday from being human. And basically, the project is that Thomas Thwaites took a whole year to learn how goats move and how they eat. And he started to design an exoskeleton, a very complicated exoskeleton, with the help of all sorts of experts, right, and engineers and so on, to move like a goat, right? And he actually tested that. He went to the Swiss Alps with all his equipment, and he tried to spend whole days with this group of goats, right? And fails, of course, because he's not able to develop a device that would allow him to digest the grass. So that was another of the elements that he was working on, because human stomachs cannot digest grass. But then he was trying to use some chemicals to pre-digest and then eat the thing, but this experiment didn't work out. So it's a story of a failure in a way, how he fails to taking this holiday. So we were engaged with this for a lot. And that sparked like a super interesting conversations with our students. And rather than thinking of it as a design solution, mimicking how to approach living like a goat, what can be foregrounded here is that how it had helped Thomas Thwaites materialize a very interesting research design question, kind of learning about these animals' physiology and functionality through his own practice. So up to that moment, parallel to that, we as a group with students, we've been learning a lot about non-intrusive approaches to human-beaver communication that are commonly used in land management. So there are all sorts of things. I don't have the pictures here, but electronic speakers or tubes are used to create the sound of water flows, which are then used to incite or to invite beavers to build at particular locations and not others. Also pipes that do not produce any type of sound. And this is very important because when there is a sound, beavers react to that. So pipes that produce no sound are used to drain beaver dams. So sound is one medium of communication. Another one is scent, so smell. So there are scents emulating castoreum, which are used to signal some territories as already occupied by other beavers, even though this is not the case, but this is some way of keeping beavers away from specific land. So this was all there, similar to the kind of explorations that Thomas Thwaites had done. And the question now was how to bring all this together in perhaps a more embodied co-design practices. So inspired by this, a proposal started to take shape, right? And the proposal developed by the students was equipping architects, designers, to create conditions for encountering and negotiating with beavers in a shared environment, in the shared environment of a river basin. And so the first part of the proposal, the first idea was to develop this suits, I call it. So first of all, like one was called like a beaver experience suit, which it was including gloves with claws and scissors and cutters instead of teeth, and also dark glasses to simulate beavers' poor vision and also stimulate the use of other senses. And this was basically designed for architects to de-learn, to unlearn the anthropocentric and ocular-centric approaches to space by means of experiencing space in a different way. And then there was also what we called a co-worker suit, which included a bottle with odors, with scents to negotiate in situ which trees not to cut and not to cut. The tubes I mentioned before that amplify the sound of water, and in that sense also ask or invite the beavers to intervene in certain spaces, and other tools like that. And this was designed not to sensitize as the first one, but actually to collaborate with beavers in the renaturalization of the basin of the river Isar. So these suits as contracts, so to speak, made emerge manifold doubts, but also inspiring conversation. So did this proposal imply that anyone who wore these devices could finally feel authorized to start redesigning the Isar River Basin on behalf of the beavers? Could this kind of, you use it once and then you are okay? So could this lead to a renaturalization project without the beavers' own expertise and knowledge in rewilding and fostering river biodiversity? So the more we got involved in thinking about these suits, the more evident it became that for any design contract enabling beavers and architects to co-design, what had to be worked out were also the devices that could enable those negotiations. So what if that enabling suit and the material processes of contracting were turned into the very proposal for the late entry for the renaturalization of the Isar River? So the question was, this is a step in the right direction, but there is the risk that it would imply that by using these ones, now you can go retreat to your studio and make the project. And the realization that we had was that maybe this was the project, the late entry for them. So this was the project to be developed. Precisely this type of artifacts, devices, and infrastructures for enabling an encounter between the humans and non-humans. So understanding that this process of creating a contract was the project itself, the renaturalization project itself, this led to developing a proposal that used the river basin as a space where to create a bond between humans and beavers. And the question then was, what are the procedures and the institutional settings for such contracting process, for such bonding process to take place? So the next step was then to develop a series of protocols on how to use each of these suits and each of the tools. So we were saying there are particular ways in which you can use these tools and you can use these suits. And these protocols were imagined to be integrated in a sort of plan of diurnal and nocturnal action and reaction, as it was called, or here day and night action and reaction plan, and also as the blueprint for an imaginary of the moment kind of institution, the Free World Biodiversity Union, that would be the institutional condition for implementing this type of encounter. These institutions was the reasoning were critical for how for this kind of for ensuring that different species could work together and co-design in the city. So as you can see, the thing to be designed changed radically. So instead of designing an urban project, we end up and everybody started designing other things, designing institutions, designing tools, designing protocols and plans. So that's basically the story I wanted to share with you. And in closing, I would like to point out some lines of tension that we see for a multi-species architectural practice that maybe can be delineated based on this experience, right? And these lines of tension involve at least 3 aspects that, yeah, might be interesting to discuss later. So, from design solutions to contracts, as from solutions to contracts as negotiation devices for joint problem making. I'm alone here among architects, so it's a risky thing to argue that architects tend to express their expertise in designing objects proposed as solutions to well-articulated needs, wishes, or demands. This premise has no currency for more than human design. Animals, and most humans too, I guess, are not capable of articulating problems in the language of architects. So what is needed are modes of joint problem making. And based on this experience, we are trying to introduce the notion of the contract to redefine the space in which architects might need to learn to correspond in the present with other human and non-human beings. So what needs to be designed then is the very process of contractual negotiation. That is the appropriateness and capability of designing with someone or in someone's name. The second idea is from users, from design for you, from user-centered design, if you want, to recognizing the animals as clients and even as co-designers. I said that at the beginning. I mean, there are these approaches like animal-aided design that consider animals as the end users of architectural practice. And obviously, this is a huge step forward, right? To think that the main user is the animal of a park and not the human that is strolling through the park. I mean, that's already great. But what if this figure of the user were not enough to really open up towards the non-human? So we explored in this experiment and in this chapter or talk, what we're trying to explore is what it entails thinking of non-humans as clients and as co-designers. The client is an interesting figure that is mostly invisibilized in a lot of architectural literature, even though the client very often acts as a full-blown co-designer intervening in all phases of design. So we think that by conceiving animals as powerful clients or as expert co-designers rather than as users, a different architectural practice can be invented, engaging, for example, the beaver abilities to make environments, and in that way develop more than human modes of co-design. And thirdly, I guess the third challenge is this idea of how to get away from this idea of the designer as an impartial arbiter, and how to move towards the idea of the designer as a committed, or even compromised, could be even stronger, as a compromise partner. So designers, and I explain this, designers are often imagined as having to arbiter between too many incommensurable requirements and demands. And so it is the role of the architect, of the designer, to find a compromise between the different requests of different actors, between the technical and the political, between the social and the economic, between the ecological and the aesthetic, between all these dimensions. So the designer is, or the architect is the one who in theory should kind of find the right balance to all these different demands. A multi-species architectural practice, we think that it requires overcoming that idea, abandoning that figure, and to think of the designer not as this impartial arbiter, but as a partner that is committed to creating conditions for more than human co-design. So the task is one, how to co-design with animals. And that sort of requirement has priority and is. So indeed, if the great challenge that the Anthropocene imposes on architecture, as I was saying at the beginning, is the need to incorporate non-human animals, their capabilities, expertise, and perspectives. So this obviously requires transforming architectural practice, becoming sensitive to the perspectives and to the practices of other than human and non-human animals, and exploring how to engage with their issues and how to learn to take their side. Okay, so this is my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ignacio. That was a wonderful story of a studio with all its surprises in between. The engagement with the students, the responses, and the turning of what probably was an intended aim at the start, and then it transforms into something else during the process. It was lovely to hear this and see the. A couple of things that come to my mind. I'm thinking that if at stake in this exploration of designing with more than human life, the beaver, the ant, the dog, so on and so forth, is about the literacy that we need to kind of, and if I don't know if I'm using the right word, is the literacy that we need to develop as architects or as humans to develop develop an engagement with care. It's a question of literacy. One of the things that your studio proposes is to enter into this exploration through the idea of the senses, sensing the landscape through the sensorium, and explorations into working with senses and the sensoriums in architecture, in the architectural field, have largely been used or kind of explored in ways of going beyond cartographic ways of thinking, and particularly which have emerged from oculocentricity and also with kind of control of certain kinds of um, property, so on and so forth. So I was wondering if this exploration into the sensorium led towards developing such a literacy, and if it didn't go towards that route, then why was such a decision taken towards not doing that? So that's something that comes to my mind. The second one, I really like the idea of the contract that you propose as a form of um, as a proposition that the studio makes. And one of the things that comes to my mind is that and I'm kind of speaking from Bombay, kind of being engaged in some in my own work in Bombay, is that it is not only more than human life, but there's a huge amount, the majority of the population itself was never a part of the contract, and it kind of engages and innovating and kind of engaging with the production of built forms. So whether we need to kind of distinguish between human and more than human life as one thing, or there are populations, there are human beings who also become a part of this. That's kind of my second thought that comes to my mind. And the third one is that, I mean, in terms of the methodological exploration, more than human life, say for instance, I mean, if one just takes the ant as such, and what are some of the coordinates that one can fix in terms of exploration? For instance, in monsoonal landscapes over here in Bombay, if you see in the forest, the annual cycle of the rain becomes very important. So you have an anthill which kind of emerges just before the monsoon, and it kind of becomes a very important marker, the changes in temperature, so on and so forth. And a lot of things happen through the whole year. So how do you the sense is not the sense of the everyday, but also a sense of a longer cyclical time, probably. So how do you kind of develop these coordinates over a long-term basis, and do certain, I mean, are we developing these literacies anew, or there are certain kinds of, there are probably groups, for instance, indigenous epistemologies and ontologies have already engaged with them, and that could become one of the ways of kind of, an entry point towards developing this exploration. So three kind of, thoughts that kind of came to me, not formulated as kind of questions, but would love to hear your thoughts, and then we could open up the conversation to the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. These are all great questions and a lot of food for thought. So first of all, I totally agree, and this was the whole kind of spirit of that series of studio courses and of writing this paper and some others, that the challenge has to do with reinventing the practices and the knowledges of those who have been put in charge of our built and environment, to put it simply. And these are architects, but not only, planners, blah, blah. And we can use your term, and there is a new literacy that needs to be developed. Actually, as some of people here might know, I'm really kind of concerned with this issue. We're currently, with some colleagues, editing a book that is called planning miseducation, and kind of trying to think about how to re-educate ourselves, right, as people concerned with the built environment, to develop a new common sense of what and how to intervene in the built environment. And and I think this is so important. And this new literacy has to do with the senses. So a thing that we always say with Tomás Criado, who is the co-author of this, is that we've been for a long time very much occupied and concerned with the question of how to visibilize the subaltern, how to empower the subaltern, how to kind of give epistemological authority to these invisibilized voices. And this is good. But what we also need to do is to think about how to sensitize experts. So it's not just, I mean, we need to kind of, our political work, so to speak, should pay attention to both sides of this asymmetry, not just empower those who are disenfranchised, but also how do we intervene in the professional cultures of experts that produce those asymmetries? And this and so the question is, how do we sensitize experts, and how do we and that has to do with exploring the senses, with developing a new common sense. So there are many delineations or declinations of the sensitization word that we can describe here. In that sense, I agree with new literacy, but actually, if you would go to the etymology of literacy, it takes us back to the reading, to the letter, to the text, and perhaps. So I agree with your substantial point, but just this little detail, perhaps it's not the better word, because it's like too much letter in literacy, too much reading, too much conventional modes of knowing and dictating what is right and wrong. So yeah, that's on the first one. Yeah, go ahead if you want to reply to this.
Just, I mean, before we go to the next point, and because you made this point of the conventional ways of knowing, and in architecture, it's been the drawing. So, yeah. So then over here, I'm just wondering if there is a proposition over here that it makes to go beyond the drawing, and if that would be, what would that proposition be in terms of expanding on this?
Yeah, I think in this case, sorry, yeah, I forgot to go into more the details. I think that I didn't spell this out in the talk, but I think this has a lot to do with the performative. So, I mean, all our experiment that you now know what it was all about how to how to create conditions for bodily experiences, for embodying relationships that change who you are and how you relate. And the body as a medium for relating versus, if you want, the drawing and the ocular, that kind of is always based on this representational, or not always, but normally, conventionally, it's based on this representational relationship to the world. And how to move from that sense to this other, to the tactile, to the smell, to the kind of feeling, the being in there. So I guess that was, and this has to do with kind of a displacement from the visual, if you want, repertoire to the more performative repertoire, where you are exposed. You can share yourself. You can. So you're exposed as a body. So and I think that's also very important for achieving this symmetrization of positions between experts who use visual means and non-experts who can only tell about their lives. So I agree about, so the contract, that's the second question, if I got this right. And I think you're making a great point, because, and I think, well, we hint to that, but we don't develop this. That at the end, that actually the challenge that we were confronting here is a challenge that is not exclusive to, let's say, animals, to the relationship between experts and non-humans. Actually, the problem is that a written contract is something that, well, for a diversity of reasons, and it doesn't really becomes the most appropriate medium for thinking together who we are and how do we want to perhaps intervene in shared worlds of cohabitation. So I think that rethinking the contract, again, as something that is performative, material, and it's actually something that is never achieved, but we're always in this process of understanding who the beavers are and creating this, that's an imaginary for a type of environmental or spatial praxis that is indeed, well, profoundly, I guess, maybe democratic is the wrong word, but profoundly open. And I think that could be the aspiration, right? So I guess the point about the contract, and I hope this was I was able to convey this, is that what we said is, at the end of the day, there's no way of establishing a contract with the beavers that would authorize me as an architect to design in the name of the beaver. All what there is an attempt at create conditions, material conditions, spatial conditions of mutual intelligibility, of mutual acknowledgement, and try to kind of recognize each other. And that is the project. And I think the same applies for all sorts of other constellations between urban majorities and, let's say, administrations, where the first step is really create conditions for kind of acknowledging each other. And that's not a precondition for a project that will happen afterwards. That's the project. Even if we don't get to understand each other at the end, that's kind of how I think the notion of the contract in this sense can be inspiring as a projectual tool in a way, right? As a projectual figure. And then the methodological question about basically what you were saying, I think you're right, is, well, actually taking these animals even more seriously. There are all sorts of ecological and ethological and things that maybe in our project were not really taken into account, that have to do with life cycles, with weather cycles, with year cycles, and this is much more complicated than what we presented. And I agree with that. Actually, we came to that question at the very end, and then we started to think about day and night. I mentioned that. So we had this kind of day and night cycle and how different it is and so on, and how, because humans tend to work during the day, beavers more during the night, so how to achieve that. But actually it's more than that cycle. There are so many other cycles that if we think this through really, in those protocols, and that would need to be taken into account, winter, summer, blah, blah, blah. So all sorts of things. And so I totally agree that this is more like a gesture that we are doing towards that. But, and obviously in a way, and this also is forcing, let's say, us to really establish powerful epistemic collaboration with, well, with ethologists, with, animal experts, and do this seriously, in order to take into account all these dimensions. So I agree about the need to be more radical in that. And I wanted to make a point about indigenous ontologies, because obviously some indigenous ontologies take that into account and so on. And I agree with that. But at the same time, this is Munich, right? And this is a bunch of, let's say, European students, from different, we had some from whatever, Belgium, I don't remember, but So, I mean, I'm from Chile, that might be different, right? But we are talking about European students working in Bavaria, in the south of Germany. And even though I think that mobilizing indigenous ontologies is super interesting in this, also in this type of context to kind of open up your mind, I also have my doubts in terms of, so we are very critical about how Western ontologies have been exported throughout, have colonized the world. And I'm not so sure if the movement is to do the inverse movement, or rather to try to undo this Western ontology from the inside, so to speak. So yeah, actually we read, for example, Marisol de la Cadena with the students and Earth Beings and stuff like that. But we didn't stay there because we thought, okay, so we need to, so we were thinking about this notion, the intravention. If we want to make not an intervention from the outside into this, but an intervention from within, we need to kind of not refer to a different thing, to a different ontology, but try to deconstruct, let's say, the assumptions of the practice from within. So yeah, it's a matter of also provincializing things, and yeah.
Thanks.
So thanks for these super questions.
Thanks, those are wonderful responses. Give me kind of food for thought. And at some point, I'll write to you later on about my thoughts. So we have one question by Kush Patel, who asks, historically and geographically, indigenous communities and tribal groups have often challenged the colonialist legacies of interventions between human and non-human worlds, often arguing that the conflict between these worlds arise from resource scarcity, exploitation, extraction, and occupation. In your positioning the studio and architectural practice away from anthropocentric and oculocentric models, then can you reflect some more on the location of this propositioning? That is, who gets to define this interest in creating or advancing coexistence? And might this approach also be a critique of colonialist technologies and legacies?
Okay, this is exactly what we were discussing, right, one moment ago. So this studio in particular was not explicitly imagined as a strategy or as a process towards the, let's say, deconstruction of the colonial imaginaries that shape certain types of land practice in Europe itself. So I think the interesting thing about when thinking about colonial relationships and that is also to pay attention not only to some people have called it like the inner colonization of Europe, right? And to what extent, well, all sorts of European areas have been inner colonized by their own kind of European modes of producing knowledge, abstracting labor, extracting resources, dividing up land, and so on. But obviously, and I think this is something that we can agree, challenging these nature-culture divides, challenging these, let's say, epistemic asymmetries between professional cultures of experts and those who are not, is a contribution towards that larger critique of colonialist, and reading from your question, it's a contribution to this critique of colonialist technologies and legacy. So it's not explicitly posed in those terms, but I think it contributes to that. It does not so by bringing in indigenous epistemologies and ontologies. So we were not saying, hey, let's take Viveiros de Castro and ontological perspectivism as an inspiration to do multi-species co-design differently. We were not doing that. We were basically more trying to unpack a little bit the practice from within. Although you could say, and now I'm thinking out loud, our key inspiration was this reference of Michel Serres to the Arpedonapta, which is this Egyptian figure. So there is some of that as well, but yeah.
Kush, I was trying to message you, but I don't have the permission, I think. Would you like to join in? then we'll kind of get you into the panel, and if you want to ask the question or kind of further the conversation. Joel, can you get Kush inside and see if he wants to kind of continue?
Yes, I've sent him a request.
Yeah, and can you please allow me permissions to send messages?
We have another question by Lindsay.
Yeah. So yeah, in the meantime, we'll take that question. So Lindsay Bremner asks, hi, Ignacio. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Your work was very inspiring to my monsoon assemblages project. I suppose what I would like to ask is to what extent you think one can co-design with the animate Earth itself, which is what my project tried to do. And by the way, the series 9 story was a story about the monsoon, about making an annual contact with the monsoon.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And Joel, can you get Lindsay into the conversation, please, too? Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah,
I definitely think that this is. By the way, I just got the Monsoon Methods wonderful book. It's on my desk, sitting there side since 2 days or 3 days. So I had a brief look at it, and it really looks fantastic. And it's a beautiful object on top of that. So congratulations for that. That's also very inspiring for our ERC project that is just starting. Yeah, I don't know how to react to this, because I definitely think that you are the expert more than me in this kind of entanglements, and I would definitely think that this is also the case. So of course, I think the challenge would need also to be to think with the forces and geological forces that are shaping landscapes and ecologies in all sorts of ways. This now that I'm thinking out loud, it kind of brings me back to a project that I did between 2010 and 2014, more or less, which was basically a study of the post-tsunami reconstruction process in Chile. And which was, of course, very shaped by all sorts of neoliberal ontologies and agendas that, as you know, are kind of championed in the Chilean context. But what I thought that, and I think I have a text about this, that is really fascinating, is to what extent the ontological disruption of the tsunami in specific moments, in specific events, in a specific context, was able to activate logics and practices of thinking the environment that were at odds with this kind of more conventional neoliberal mode of doing things. So it was very interesting how this overflowing event, this massive event, was capable to overflow governmental logics and open up spaces for rethinking the relationship of cities, communities, and so on with the earth, with trees, with moving coastlines, with waters. So there was this. At the end of the day, of course, the reconstruction process was still dominated by this subsidiary logic of the neoliberal state, and to a great extent, none of those moments kind of led to anywhere. But it was fascinating to see how these earthly forces can really open up spaces of reimagining the relationship between, let's say, urban planning and the cities and the environment. So I agree, but I guess you have also a lot to say about that.
Rohit, thank you. Do you want me to respond? Should I?
Yes, sure, please do.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I mean, that's a very Isabel Stenger's kind of point, Ignacio, you know, the idea of these moments of disruption which open up cosmopolitical opportunities. And so great. But if I could possibly just talk about something slightly different, what I found fascinating about your talk is that you have offered an absolutely extraordinary alternative to ideas of biomimicry and biodesign, which kind of are the default positions that architects take when thinking about designing with animals or nature. So, you know, I think this idea of the contract is an extraordinarily powerful one that I think will be, you know, I'll take away with me from this lecture for, you know, that designing the contract through which one engages with a beaver or a creek, as I'm currently working on in Chennai. That contract is the project, and that is just an extraordinary idea, I think.
Thanks. That's lovely. Those are the two things I do take from this talk too. That was a really inspiring proposition. I don't know if we have any other questions, but if anybody has any questions, I mean, I can draw people into the panel so we can have a direct conversation with Ignacio. If not, then
we have one by Parisat.
Yes. Now I see it. There's one by Parizad Barianwala, who says, very interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing. As architects, we tend to project a lot of ourselves, our ideas, our desires onto our designs. We often tend to forget that we are designing for the client with their money, on their land. I believe learning to design with animals, after taking the time and effort to understand their natural habitat, preferences, behavior, and activity patterns, can help change this approach, thereby making us better architects even when we design for other humans, removing ourselves from the center. Yeah.
Thanks.
Get Parizad in too, I mean.
Sorry, Freud?
No, I just asked Joel to get Parizad into the conversation. So if she has a follow-up comment, she could kind of come. I guess Joel is not on. Maybe you can start with the response and then.
I've sent her a request.
Okay, Joel. Yeah, let her choose if she'd like to come in or not. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, thanks, Parisat, for your comment. I essentially agree with what you are saying. I think that for me, the challenge is the with, not the for. So one of your sentences, I believe learning to design for, with animals. I would, oh, hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, so sorry. I thought I was frozen. So I guess the challenge is the with, not the for. As I was saying before, designing for animals can take us back to our kind of, let's say, conventional position that we know what is good for them, and as we know what is good for everyone, and then we can just go and do it. So I think the challenge is the with, and I would just emphasize the need to to not to remove ourselves as architects, but actually to decenter, let's say, ourselves, and to become partners with these other designers, right?
I hope that answers Perizad's question. So those are the questions that we have today. It was really wonderful to hear your propositions, Ignacio, and I do take away those 2 big points to kind of think through the contract and to think of the performative in terms of expanding expertise within the design fields. So thank you for those provocations. That's been a big learning from this talk, and we'll be in touch with you and in conversation with you as and when the opportunity arises. This C-Series conversation has been made possible by support from the Shama Foundation, along with the ongoing support of the Urban Center Mumbai. We thank both these organizations for supporting our lecture series. The next conversation, the final conversation of this series will be on 23rd September, and that will be by Maqsood Ali Mondal. We'll keep you posted with our announcements and posters. That's all from us. And thank you once again, Ignacio, and everybody who's been here.
I would also like to use the opportunity to thank everyone and for the invitation. And this has been a wonderful conversation. And these 2 points that you take away are points that I'm also taking away, because sometimes in the mass of the things that you're saying, you lose perspective, and emphasizing these 2 things also allow me to see this own work differently. So thank you for that. And thank you all for your attention and your questions.
Pleasure to have you.